You're nothing but a useless old woman who should have died years ago. The scream echoed through the halls of the Hamilton mansion, followed by the sound of something breaking on the floor. Thomas Hamilton froze at the entrance to the house, keys still in hand, trying to process what he had just heard. Through the half-open door to the living room, he saw his wife Victoria pushing his 72-year-old mother against the armchair, while the elderly woman cried softly, confused and frightened. "Please don't hurt me," begged Rose Hamilton, the woman who had once been the most respected matriarch of Manhattan high society. "Hurt you? You don't even know who I am half the time." Victoria shouted again, squeezing her mother-in-law's frail arm with unnecessary force. Eduardo would be so much happier without having to carry his dead weight. It was then that Thomas saw something that would change everything. A figure moved in the shadows of the hallway. Keisha Williams, the new caregiver they had hired just 2 weeks ago. The 35-year-old woman watched the scene with an expression that mixed horror and silent determination. Thomas Hamilton never imagined that his 50-year life, built on million-dollar businesses and an impeccable reputation, would crumble because of secrets that took place within his own home. A widower for 5 years, he had remarried thinking that Victoria would take care of his mother, who was in the early stages of Alzheimer's. Keisha didn't say a word, but her eyes captured every detail of that cruelty. Discreetly, she took her cell phone out of her pocket and began recording, her hands steady despite the anger she felt rising in her chest. Raised in the Bronx, the daughter of a grandmother who had also suffered from dementia, she knew abuse when she saw it. "Keisha!" Victoria shouted when she noticed the caregiver's presence. "Where were you? His job is to stay here and take care of her." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Victoria," Keisha replied calmly, quickly putting away her phone. "I was preparing Mrs. Rose's afternoon medications." Thomas watched the interaction from afar, noticing how his mother instantly calmed down when she saw Keisha. It was as if the presence of her brought a peace he hadn't seen on Rose's face in months. "Keisha, my dear," Rose whispered, reaching out her trembling hands. "You're back." Victoria rolled her eyes dismissively. "See? She mistakes you for her. Pathetic." But Keisha knelt gently beside the elderly woman, holding her hands tenderly. "I'm here, Mrs. Rose. I'll always be here when you need me." Thomas remained hidden, a strange feeling washing over him. There was something about the way Keisha treated her mother, a genuine tenderness that contrasted sharply with the cruel impatience he had just witnessed from Victoria. At that moment, watching his mother finally relax in the arms of someone who seemed to truly care, Thomas realized that perhaps he didn't know his own wife as well as he thought. More importantly, there was something in Keisha's determined eyes that suggested she wasn't just another caregiver willing to accept any treatment in silence. While Victoria continued to grumble about the inconvenience of having to deal with a sick mother-in-law, Keisha maintained a serene expression that hid a storm. Because if there was one thing that years of caring for his own grandmother had taught him, it was that some battles need to be fought in silence, until the time comes to make the right noise. If you're enjoying this story of justice and overcoming adversity, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what Keisha was about to discover about Victoria, and what she would do with that information will leave you speechless. In the days following what Thomas had witnessed, Victoria intensified her campaign of psychological terror against Rose, as if she sensed his time was running out. What she didn't know was that every cruel act was being meticulously documented by eyes that had learned to see injustice long before stepping foot in that mansion. Keisha had grown up in the Bronx caring for her own grandmother, Mama Dorothy, who also suffered from Alzheimer's. At 16, when his parents were working 3 jobs each just to pay the rent, she had become an expert at recognizing the signs, the morning confusion, the constant repetitions, the fear in the eyes when reality fragmented. More importantly, she knew how to identify when someone was taking advantage of that vulnerability. "Keisha, where's my purse?" Rose asked for the 10th time that morning, her hands shaking as she searched for something she couldn't quite name. "It's right here on his lap, Mrs. Rose," Keisha replied patiently, for the 10th time, adjusting the purse the elderly woman was holding without realizing it. Victoria watched from the doorway with an expression of barely concealed disgust. "She's getting worse every day. Completely useless." "Actually," Keisha said calmly, not taking her eyes off Rose, she had 3 moments of complete lucidity yesterday. She remembered Mr. Thomas's birthday, told stories from his childhood, even asked about the family business. "Lies," Victoria spat. "You're making this up to look competent." Keisha finally looked at Victoria, his brown eyes revealing a firmness that Thomas's wife was not used to seeing in employees. "Why would I lie about that?" It was at that moment that Victoria noticed something unsettling. Keisha didn't lower her eyes, didn't stutter, didn't apologize for existing. There was a dignity there that irritated her deeply, because it reminded her that some people couldn't be bought or intimidated. "Maybe because you want to impress my husband," Victoria said, her voice laced with venom. "I've seen how you two talk when he gets home from work. Very convenient, don't you think?" Thomas, who had just entered the room, heard only the end of the conversation. "What are you talking about?" "Nothing important," Victoria smiled sweetly, instantly transforming into the perfect wife. "Just discussing her medication routine." Kqaren observed this transformation with the same scientific attention she used to study Rose's behavior patterns. Victoria was a consummate actress, but she had grown up in a community where survival meant quickly deciphering masks. That afternoon, while Victoria was out for another of her weekly beauty sessions, Kqaren took the opportunity to talk to Rose during a moment of clarity. "Mrs. Rose, do you remember what happened yesterday when I went out to get his medication?" The old woman's eyes clouded with fear. She said bad things. She said that Thomas would be happier if I wasn't here. "And do you believe that?" Rose held Kqaren's hand with surprising strength. "Sometimes I think maybe she's right. I forget so much. I get so confused. I'm a burden to his son." "No, ma'am. The disease makes you forget some things, but it doesn't change who you are inside. And inside, you are a strong woman who raised a good man." Kqaren knew she had to act, but she also knew that an accusation without evidence would be the word of a black caregiver against that of a wealthy white woman. In the Bronx, she had learned that justice was not something that fell from the sky. It was something you built brick by brick, piece of evidence by piece of evidence. Over the next 2 weeks, Kqaren developed a meticulous routine. She arrived 15 minutes early and stayed 15 minutes late, always with a plausible excuse. She discreetly installed an app on her cell phone that automatically recorded conversations when it detected raised voices. Victoria, increasingly confident in her position, began to let her guard down. She yelled at Rose even when other employees were around, made derogatory comments about the elderly woman's incompetence in front of visitors, and even pushed Rose when she thought no one was looking. "Do you know what his problem is, Rose?" Victoria said one Thursday, while forcing his mother-in-law to take medication that Kqaren suspected was unnecessary. "You don't know when to die." The recording captured every word, every cruel tone, every sob from Rose. Thomas began to notice subtle changes in his wife's behavior. She was more impatient, more critical, as if her mother's presence irritated her just by existing. But whenever he came home, he found Kqaren caring for Rose with infinite patience, and her mother seemed calmer, more present. "Kqaren," Thomas said one afternoon, "my mother seems different when you're here." "How so, Mr. Thomas?" "More, she herself. It's hard to explain." Kqaren smiled sadly. People with Alzheimer's respond very much to the emotional environment around them. When they feel safe, they can access more of themselves. Thomas nodded, but something in Kqaren's gaze suggested there was more being said between the lines. Victoria, watching this conversation from afar, felt a twinge of something she couldn't quite identify. It wasn't quite fear, but a growing unease. There was something about the way Kqaren had been looking at her lately, as if she knew a secret. "Thomas," Victoria said that night, lying next to her husband, "I'm worried about Kqaren." "Worried how?" "She's very involved. Sometimes I think she confuses his role here. She's not family, she's just an employee." Thomas was silent for a moment. "She takes good care of my mother. I don't see a problem with that." Victoria felt irritation rising. "Of course you don't. You're hardly ever here to see how things really work." But Kqaren was building something much more solid than resentment. Every recording was transcribed, every incident documented with date and time, every change in Rose's behavior meticulously catalogued. She knew that when the time came to act, she would need something irrefutable. While Victoria believed she completely controlled the narrative of that house, Kqaren was quietly building a case that would destroy not only Thomas's wife's reputation, but potentially her freedom. Because there was one thing Victoria never discovered about the new caregiver. Before devoting herself to caring for the elderly, Kqaren had studied law for 2 years, abandoning her studies only when her family's financial situation became untenable. She knew exactly which laws Victoria was violating, which crimes she was committing, and most importantly, she knew exactly how to document everything in a way that no expensive lawyer could contest. What Victoria interpreted as respectful submission was, in fact, the calculated patience of someone who understood that true justice does not come from anger, but from meticulous preparation. And while Thomas's wife slept peacefully, believing that her social position protected her from any consequences, Kqaren worked in the shadows, building a storm that would forever change the lives of everyone in that mansion. During her 3rd week of documentation, Kqaren made a decision that would completely change the course of events. On her day off, she traveled 40 minutes by subway to downtown Manhattan to meet someone he hadn't seen in 3 years, Marcus Johnson, his former law school classmate who now worked as an assistant district attorney. "Kqaren Williams," Marcus said as he opened the door to his small apartment, a genuine smile lighting up his face. "When I got her message, I thought it was a joke. It's been so long. I need your help, Marcus. And before you ask, it's not for her." Over the next 40 minutes, Kqaren meticulously presented all the material she had collected, audio recordings, photographs of the medications, medical documents that Victoria claimed were legitimate prescriptions, and a detailed diary of each incident of abuse. Marcus listened silently, her expression gradually changing from curiosity to horror, then to controlled professional anger. Keisha, this isn't just elder abuse. Based on these unprescribed medications and the implied financial manipulation, we're talking about at least 4 serious crimes. I know, but I need more evidence before she realizes what's going on. You're playing with fire. If she finds out you're investigating... Keisha interrupted him with a determined look. Marcus, I grew up in the Bronx taking care of my grandmother while my mother worked 3 jobs. I know how to recognize predators, and I know how to deal with them. Marcus picked up one of the recordings and played it again, shaking his head. Her tone of voice, the systematic cruelty. This is planned psychological torture. I'll consult his superiors unofficially, but keep collecting evidence. I need something irrefutable. Meanwhile, at the Hamilton mansion, Victoria had decided that Keisha posed a threat that needed to be eliminated. But instead of firing her outright, which would raise questions from Thomas, she opted for a more subtle and cruel approach. Keisha, Victoria said one Friday morning, I need to talk to you about some irregularities I've noticed in his work. Keisha kept her expression neutral. What kind of irregularities, Ms. Victoria? Medications that are disappearing, petty cash that doesn't add up, some jewelry that Rose can't find. Victoria smiled coldly. Now, I'm not accusing anyone directly, but... Yes, you are, Keisha replied calmly. And if you have evidence for these accusations, I suggest you call the police immediately. Keisha's unshakable calm irritated Victoria deeply. She had expected desperate denial, tears, pleas. Instead, she found the same quiet dignity that had bothered her from day one. Maybe I should call the police, Victoria said, testing the reaction. Unless you prefer to leave quietly, with a good letter of recommendation. Keisha chuckled softly, a sound that made Victoria instinctively recoil. Mr. Victoria, if you have evidence that I have committed a crime, please call the authorities. I would be curious to see that evidence. At that moment, Thomas entered the kitchen where the conversation was taking place. What are you talking about? Nothing important, Victoria said quickly, but her voice had lost the arrogant confidence of seconds before. Actually, Keisha said, looking directly at Thomas, your wife was accusing her of theft. He said that if she has evidence, she should call the police. Thomas looked from one to the other, noticing the palpable tension. Theft? Victoria, what are you talking about? I was just commenting on some things that are missing. I wasn't accusing anyone specifically. Keisha smiled. I see. Misunderstandings happen. Mr. Thomas, if you don't mind, I would like to suggest that we install security cameras in the common areas of the house to protect us all from future confusion. The suggestion landed like a bomb. Victoria visibly paled, while Thomas frowned, processing the implication. Cameras are a good idea, Thomas said slowly, for the safety of my mother and everyone in the house. Victoria tried to protest, but the words came out jumbled and meaningless. Keisha watched every micro-expression of panic on the face of the woman who had tortured Rose for months. That afternoon, while Victoria left claiming a sudden medical emergency, Keisha took the opportunity to have a crucial conversation with Rose during a moment of lucidity. Mrs. Rose, I need you to help me with something very important. Of course, my dear. What can I do? Keisha gently held the elderly woman's hands. I want you to know that you are safe now, and I want you to know that nothing Victoria says about him is true. He is not a burden. He is loved. Rose began to cry, but they were tears of relief. Sometimes I think I'm going crazy, that the bad things I remember her doing are just his confused mind. They're not his mind. And soon, she'll never be able to hurt you again. Thomas, who had come home early from work without warning, overheard part of this conversation from the hallway. The confirmation that his mother had indeed been abused hit him like a punch in the stomach. That night, he sought out Keisha in the garden, where she often walked after work. Keisha, I need to know the truth. Has her wife been mistreating my mother? The direct question deserved a direct answer. Mr. Thomas, his mother has been the victim of systematic emotional and physical abuse for months, and I have evidence to prove it. Thomas closed his eyes, as if the words were knives. Why didn't you tell me before? Because I needed irrefutable proof. The word of a black caregiver against that of a wealthy white woman is rarely taken seriously. But now I have evidence that no lawyer can dispute. It was then that Thomas realized something he should have noticed long ago. Keisha didn't speak like someone who had only cared for the elderly her entire life. There was a legal precision to her words, an understanding of procedures that you don't learn by caring for people. You studied law was not a question, but a statement. Keisha nodded. 2 years at NYU. I had to stop because of financial problems, but I never stopped learning. Thomas looked at her with a mixture of admiration and horror. Horror that he had been blind for so long. Admiration that she had protected her mother when he had failed to do so. What do you need from him? Just continue to be the good man her mother raised you to be. I'll take care of the rest. That morning, while Victoria slept beside Thomas, believing she had successfully intimidated the inconvenient caregiver, Keisha finished a 53-page dossier documenting every crime, every abuse, every manipulation. Marcus had secured a preliminary hearing with the chief prosecutor for the following week. The recordings had been analyzed by forensic audio experts. The medications had been identified as controlled substances obtained illegally. The pattern of abuse was documented with scientific precision. Victoria Hamilton, in her arrogance, had completely underestimated a woman who carried not only the personal pain of having lost her own grandmother to the same disease, but also the legal knowledge necessary to destroy predators like he. As the storm formed around him without her noticing, Victoria continued to sleep peacefully, perhaps dreaming of the day when she would be free of the inconvenience of Rose Hamilton. What she could not imagine was that very soon, it would be her who would wish she had never met that family, and especially never crossed paths with Keisha Williams. There, in the silence of that early morning, as she organized the final pieces of evidence that would seal Victoria's fate, Keisha smiled for the first time in months. Not a smile of revenge, but of imminent justice. Because sometimes, the difference between an ordinary caregiver and someone who can change the game is not in what you see on the outside, but in the power he carries inside, and that only reveals itself when the time is right to show what he is truly capable of. Victoria woke up irritated, unaware that this would be the last day she would sleep in the Hamilton mansion as his mistress of the house. When she opened the door, she found 2 Manhattan police detectives and Marcus Johnson, the assistant district attorney. Mrs. Victoria Hamilton, I'm Detective Rodriguez. We have a search and seizure warrant related to allegations of elder abuse and illegal administration of controlled medications. Victoria's blood ran cold. There must be some mistake. I care for my mother-in-law with all my heart. Based on evidence presented to the district attorney's office, including audio recordings and extensive documentation, we have reason to believe that crimes have been committed in this residence, Marcus said calmly, showing the official papers. That's when Keisha appeared at the door, gently holding his arm. Victoria looked at the caregiver as if seeing her for the first time. You, she whispered, the realization hitting her like a bolt of lightning. Me, Keisha confirmed, her voice calm but firm. Keisha Williams, NYU law graduate, specializing in elder law and crimes against vulnerable populations. Victoria's mask of confidence crumbled instantly. You're just a caregiver. I'm a caregiver who also happens to be a lawyer, who also happens to be the daughter of a woman who worked 60 hours a week to give me an education, who also happens to be the granddaughter of a woman who died of Alzheimer's while being treated with dignity, not with the cruelty you imposed on Mrs. Rose. Marcus opened her briefcase and began playing one of the recordings on her cell phone. Victoria's voice echoed clearly, you're nothing but a useless old woman who should have died years ago. Rose cringed as she listened, but Keisha squeezed his hand gently. It's okay now, Mrs. Rose. She'll never be able to hurt you again. That was taken out of context. Victoria stammered desperately. She was having an episode. He was trying to calm her down. Detective Rodriguez played another recording. I'm going to increase his medication until he's completely vegetated. I'll convince Thomas that he needs to be admitted to a nursing home. 53 pages of documentation, Marcus said coldly, 23 audio recordings, photographs of illegally obtained controlled medications, and statements from 3 house staff who witnessed his abuse. Thomas arrived at that moment, alerted by an emergency call from Keisha. He stopped at the door, observing the scene, her in a panic, police officers searching the house, his mother trembling but clearly relieved. Thomas. Victoria rushed to him. She set this all up. It's a trap to separate us. Thomas looked at Keisha, who was holding Rose protectively. Is it true? Did you document everything? Every cruel word, every push, every forced medication, every threat, Keisha replied. His mother has suffered systematic psychological torture for months, Mr. Thomas, and I promised her it would end. Detective Rodriguez found Victoria's stash of drugs hidden in the closet, heavy sedatives, unprescribed antipsychotics, drugs that explained Rose's rapid deterioration. Victoria Hamilton, you're under arrest for elder abuse, illegal administration of controlled substances, psychological torture, and medical fraud. No. Victoria screamed as the handcuffs were put on. Thomas, you can't let this happen. I'm his wife. Thomas looked at her with a mixture of disgust and deep sadness. You tortured my mother. There is no forgiveness for that. As Victoria was led away by the police, screaming threats and accusations, Rose finally spoke, her voice clearer than it had been in months. Thank you, my daughter, she said to Keisha. You saved my life. Thomas approached Keisha, tears in his eyes. How can I thank you for protecting my mother when I failed? You didn't fail, Mr. Thomas. You just trusted the wrong person. But now your mother is safe. Marcus smiled as he watched the scene. Keisha, you could have a brilliant career in the public prosecutor's office, if you're still interested. Maybe, Keisha replied, looking at Rose, who was finally smiling without fear. But first I have a promise to keep. As the police van disappeared into the rain, taking Victoria to a reality very different from the one she was used to, the Hamilton mansion breathed for the first time in months. Victoria had completely underestimated a woman who carried not only compassion, but also knowledge, determination, and the quiet strength of those who know that true justice does not shout, she acts. There on that rainy morning, it became clear that sometimes the difference between a victim and an avenger is not in what one suffers, but in what one does with that suffering. And Keisha had turned each of Rose's tears into a precision weapon that destroyed her torturer once and for all. 6 months later, the Hamilton mansion breathed a peace that had been lost for years. Rose, free from toxic medications and psychological terror, had regained much of her lucidity. Her mornings were now filled with genuine laughter and conversations that lasted for hours. Keisha was no longer just a caregiver. Thomas had hired her as an elder rights consultant for his philanthropic foundation, recognizing that her skills went far beyond basic care. You saved my mother and opened my eyes, Thomas said one afternoon as they watched Rose painting in the garden, a hobby she had rediscovered. How can I repay you? By helping other families avoid what we went through, Keisha replied simply. Marcus called that same day with news. Victoria was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Elder abuse, illegal administration of medication, fraud. Her case has become a legal precedent. Victoria, who had once slept in silk sheets believing her social status protected her from any consequences, now shared a cell with women she would have despised in her previous life. Rose held Keisha's hand during dinner. My daughter, you taught me that strength is silent. It only acts when it needs to. Thomas smiled as he watched the two most important women in his life. Keisha had turned her house into a home again, not through romance or manipulation, but through something much more powerful, genuine integrity. The Hamilton Williams Foundation for the Protection of the Elderly, established months later, had already saved dozens of victims of family abuse. Keisha had found her true calling by combining law, care, and justice. Victoria had tried to destroy a family out of greed, but ended up creating something much stronger, an alliance built on mutual respect, protection of the vulnerable, and the certainty that predators always underestimate the quiet strength of those who truly care. The best revenge was not to humiliate Victoria publicly, but to build something that would last much longer than his prison sentence. Keisha proved that true strength does not shout to be heard. She acts with precision when necessary. If this story touched him, subscribe to the channel for more stories that show how quiet determination can bring down giants, and how sometimes justice comes through the most unlikely, but most prepared hands.